What if you've never actually been still? Not once. Even now, lying there, thinking this is a quiet moment, you are moving faster than you can imagine. The ground beneath you is spinning. The planet carrying you is racing around a star. That star is drifting through the galaxy, and the galaxy itself is not staying in place either. You are not resting, you are being carried through space, through time, through something so large it doesn't even have a proper edge, and yet it feels still. Because your mind was never meant to feel motion like this. It simplifies, it shrinks everything down into something comfortable. A sky, a horizon, a world that feels stable. But that stability is an illusion, because just beyond what you can see, there are places in this same system that would erase that feeling instantly. Worlds where storms never end, where pressure crushes without warning, where time itself feels broken. Places where the rules you trust don't apply the same way. And the strangest part is, you are already inside that system. You've just been living in one of the rare exceptions. A place where things happen to align just enough for everything to feel normal. But normal is not the rule out there. It's the anomaly. And tonight, we're going to leave that anomaly behind. Not physically, you're not going anywhere, but mentally, you're going to drift past the familiar sky, past the planets you think you understand, into places that don't feel like they were meant for anything to exist at all. Not fast, slowly, quietly. Because the deeper you go, the less this feels like a journey, and the more it feels like a realization that the universe is not built to be comfortable. It's built to exist, and somewhere inside it, you are here, just aware enough to notice. So don't rush. Don't try to hold on to anything. Just listen, breathe, and let yourself drift a little farther than usual, because once you see it this way, it's hard to unsee. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Now, let's begin. Part 1, the beginning of the drift. Have you ever wondered if there are places in our solar system where existence itself begins to feel unstable? Not just places where life can't survive, but places where the idea of being there at all starts to fall apart. Maybe you're lying down right now. The day is over, your thoughts are still moving just a little too fast. Or maybe you're here on purpose because thinking about distant worlds feels quieter than thinking about your own. Tonight, we're not going anywhere quickly. There's no destination, no rush, just a slow drift through the most unsettling places in our solar system. Through storms that never stop, through landscapes that were never meant to be seen, through worlds that feel almost like mistakes. And before we begin, if these quiet journeys help you unwind, if they give your mind somewhere soft to land, you can gently like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this quiet corner find other restless minds. Now, just breathe, slowly. And imagine that gravity is loosening its grip on you. You're not falling, you're drifting. The solar system looks simple when we draw it. A bright star at the center, planets moving in calm, perfect paths, everything neatly arranged. It feels controlled, predictable, almost safe. But that's just the diagram, not the reality. Because in reality, the solar system is not calm, it is not gentle, it is a collection of extremes. At the far edges, where sunlight arrives as a faint memory, there are winds that move faster than sound. Not storms like the ones we know, no thunder, no rain, just invisible currents racing across a frozen world at over 2,000 kilometers per hour. Sound there. Only motion. A silence moving faster than anything you've ever experienced. Closer in, there is a scar on a planet so large it could stretch across an entire continent on Earth, not carved by water, not shaped by wind, but torn open as the planet itself pulled apart. A wound. Some worlds don't even have protection. No magnetic shield, no invisible barrier, just constant exposure to the raw force of a star. Over time, their atmospheres are stripped away, piece by piece, until what remains is something unrecognizable. And deeper still, inside the distant giants, something strange may be happening. Rain, but not water, not ice. Diamonds, tiny crystals forming in darkness, falling endless of pressure we can barely imagine. No one is there to see it. No one hears it. And yet, physics suggests it might be real. That's the unsettling part. The universe doesn't need to make sense to us. It just needs to be consistent with itself. And sometimes that's worse. Because here on Earth, things feel balanced. We have shifting continents, oceans that regulate temperature, a system that quietly keeps everything within limits. But that balance is rare. Most places don't have it. They are either too still, or some bodies in space are so small they shouldn't have companions, and yet they do. Tiny moons orbiting even smaller objects, as if gravity refuses to let anything be truly alone. And then there are places where the rules feel broken, a world so close to the S thing but heat, and yet in its deepest shadows, ice survives, frozen, untouched, hidden from the light forever, a planet of fire and cold existing at the same time. It shouldn't work, but it does. The sun is constantly changing. Every second, it loses millions of tons of its own mass, converted into light, into warmth, into the energy you feel on your skin. But even that light is delayed. What you see is already in the past. About 8 minutes old, what hing as immediate as sunlight is never truly now. And out there, far beyond where we can easily see, there are structures that look permanent, but are slowly disappearing. Massive rings made of ice and dust falling back into the planet they surround, not collapsing, not breaking, just fading. Over time, everything does. Some planets don't have oceans, don't have understand it, and yet they experience storms that can cover the entire world. Dust lifting into the air and never quite settling, a sky that becomes the storm itself. And beneath the surface of certain frozen moons, there may be oceans, not visible, not accessible, but in the dark, possibly holding something alive. And that's when the feeling starts to change. Because the solar system isn't just a collection of planets. It's a place where sea hack down, where familiar ideas stop applying, where normal quietly disappears. And maybe the most unsettling part is not what we've discovered, but how much of it still doesn't fully make sense. Because this journey isn't about beauty, not really. It's about perspective. About realizing that the place we call home might be the exception, not the rule. And as we drift farther into the darker parts of this system, that realization will only get heavier. So don't rush, just keep drifting. Part 2, the first disturbance. At first, it all still feels distant, abstract, numbers, facts, things you can listen to without really feeling them. But that begins to change, slowly, because the deeper you drift, the harder it becomes to stay detached. Let's move closer, not too close, just enough to start noticing something unusual. Mars, a quiet world at first glance, dry, still, almost familiar. If you stood there for just a moment, it might even feel manageable. Low gravity, a pale sky, endless horizons. But then you would notice the scale. There's a canyon there, so vast for thousands of kilometers, longer than entire countries, and deeper than anything on Earth. Not carved by rivers, not shaped by flowing water, but split open, as if the planet itself once tried to come apart, nodding at its edge. No sound of wind through trees, no distant ocean, just silence falling downward for miles. And then something else begins to happen. The sky changes. At first it's subtle, a faint haze, a soft red veil. Then the light dims, not because the sun has set, but because the planet itself is lifting into the air. Dust everywhere, not grains you can brush away, not particles you can easily escape, but something finer, lighter, persistent. It rises and it stays. Storms begin this way, small, localized, barely noticeable. But Mars has a habit of letting small things grow. The dust traps heat, the heat drives wind, the wind lifts more dust, and slowly the entire planet disappears into its own atmosphere. A world there are moments when the sun becomes just a dim glow, when shadows vanish, when direction no longer means anything. And if you were there, you wouldn't see the storm coming. You would simply realize you were already inside it. And it wouldn't end quickly. These storms can last for weeks, sometimes months, long enough for anything relying on light to slowly fade. Machines have already learned this. There was once a rover moving carefully across the Martian surface. It watched the sky grow darker, day by day, until the sunlight just wasn't enough anymore. And then it stopped speaking. Not with a crash, not with a just silence. That's how many things end out here. Quietly. But Mars isn't the most unsettling place, not even close, because what makes Mars disturbing is that it almost feels familiar, and yet something is missing. Something important. Movement. Not the kind you can see. Not the kind you can see, but the kind that keeps a world alive. On Earth, the ground moves. Slowly, continents drift, mountains rise, oceans reshape the land, the planet breathes. But Mars doesn't. Its surface is locked, frozen in time. The scars you see are unchanged for millions, even billions of years. It is a world that remembers everything and forgets nothing. And that is a different kind of discomfort because nothing resets, nothing renews. Everything that happens stays. Now drift a little farther, not away from Mars, but deeper into the idea it represents. A world that almost worked, a world that had the right ingredients at the wrong scale, too small to hold its atmosphere, too quiet to sustain change, left behind in a kind of planetary stillness. And that raises a question, not a loud one, but one that lingers. How many worlds almost became something more? How many came close and then just stopped? Because the solar system is full of these near misses. Places where conditions aligned for a moment and then drifted apart, too cold, too violent, too unstable, or simply too quiet. And as you continue drifting, you begin to notice something else, a pattern. Not everything out here is trying to destroy you. Some places just don't care that you exist. And that indifference can feel even heavier because on Earth, everything interacts. Air moves around you, water responds, heat transfers. You are always part of a system. But out here, there are places where nothing responds at all. No feedback, no adjustment, just conditions that remain exactly as they are, whether you're there or not. And somewhere between those extremes, violence and indifference, is where most of the solar system exists. Not designed, not balanced, just what happened to form. And Mars is your first real glimpse of that truth. A world that looks like it should feel familiar, but doesn't. A world that invites you to imagine standing on it, and then quietly reminds you that you don't belong there. Not because it rejects you, but because it was never made with you in mind. And this is only the beginning, because the next places we drift toward won't feel familiar at all. Not even a little. Just keep drifting. Part 3, the world that went too far. If Mars felt like something that almost worked, then the next place feels like something that went too far. Not broken, not incomplete, but pushed past a point where anything could return. Drift a little closer to the sun now. Not all the way. Just enough to feel the pressure begin to change. This is where we find a world that looks at first like Earth. Similar size, similar mass, similar composition. If you didn't know better, you might think it's a twin, but it isn't. It's something else entirely. This is Venus, and nothing about it is gentle. The first thing you would notice is not the heat, it's the sky. You wouldn't see it clearly, not really, because the entire planet is wrapped in clouds, thick, dense, unbroken, a permanent layer of atmosphere that never opens. No blue, no stars, just a ceiling that never moves out of the way, and beneath it, pressure. Not the kind you feel in your ears on an airplane, but something heavier, something that presses on everything, all the time. Standing there would feel less like standing and more like being held down. Crushed slowly, without motion, because the atmosphere here is not light. It's thick with carbon dioxide, dense enough to trap heat in a way that never stops. And when you would notice the temperature, not rising, not changing, just already there, hot enough to melt metal, hot enough that nothing familiar survives. And yet, this isn't the strangest part, because the heat isn't coming from where you expect. Not directly from the sun, but from the atmosphere itself. A runaway greenhouse effect that locked the planet into a state it can't escape from. The heat G, it doesn't come out, and over time, the system feeds itself, getting hotter and hotter, until equilibrium stops meaning anything. Now imagine something else. Time. On Earth, time feels consistent. Days pass, nights return, there's a rhythm. But on Venus, that rhythm is broken. A single rotation takes longer than its entire orbit around the sun, which means a day is low. Think about that. The sun rises, and before it rises again, the planet has already completed a full trip around its star. But even that isn't quite right, because Venus doesn't spin the way you expect. It rotates backwards, slowly, reluctantly, as if something long ago forced it to change direction. So the sun would rise in the west, and a sky that moves the wrong way and moves so slowly that you might not notice it at all. Days that feel endless, but not in a peaceful way, in a way that feels stuck, unchanging, as if time itself has lost interest in moving forward. And then there's something missing, something invisible but important, a magnetic field. Earth has one. It protects us, shields us from solar radiation, but Venus, there is no global protection, no invisible barrier to everything the sun releases. Over time, this matters. It changes the atmosphere, strips away lighter elements, alters the chemistry of the entire planet, and slowly, quietly locks it into the state it's in now. A world that might have once been different, a world that might have once had oceans, but lost them. Not in a sudden event, but gradually, inevitably. And that's what makes Venus unsettling. Not just what it is, but what it could have been, because it's not completely alien. It's familiar enough to recognize and different enough to feel wrong, like looking at something that almost makes sense but doesn't. And somewhere in that difference, there's a quiet question. How thin is the line between a world that works and one that doesn't? Because Earth and Venus started with similar ingredients. Similar size, similar materials, but one became stable and the other became permanent fire. Not because of a single event, but because of a process that never stopped. And once it began, there was no way back. That's the part that lingers. Not the heat, not the pressure, but the idea that some changes, once they start, can't be undone. And somewhere in the solar system, there are many versions of that story. Worlds that crossed a line and kept going, too far to return, too stable to collapse, just stuck in extremes. Venus is one of them, but not the worst, not even close. Because as we move outward again, away from the sun, we're going to find places where the danger isn't heat, but something colder, something quieter, and somehow even less forgiving. Keep drifting. Part 4, the silence that burns. If Venus felt overwhelming, then what comes next feels stripped down. Not intense, not chaotic, just exposed. Drift even closer to the sun now, closer than any world we've visited so far. And you arrive at Mercury, a place where nothing protects you, not from heat, not from cold, not even from space itself. At first, it doesn't look dramatic. No thick clouds, no violent storms, just a surface of rock, gray, silent, covered in craters. It almost feels dead. But that stillness is misleading, because Mercury isn't calm, it's extreme in a quieter way. A way that doesn't announce itself until you notice what's missing. There is no real atmosphere here, nothing thick enough to hold heat, nothing dense enough to scatter light, just a thin exosphere, a fragile cloud of atoms barely held in place. They collide, they escape, constantly replaced and constantly lost, which means nothing stays. Not heat, not air, not balance, and that changes everything. On one side of Mercury, the sun never seems to move. It hangs there, large, blinding, burning the surface to temperatures that would melt metal. The ground absorbs it all, with nowhere for the heat to go. But then, slowly, very slowly, the planet turns, and that same surface begins to fall into darkness. Not twilight, not sunset, just absence. And without an atmosphere, there is nothing to hold the warmth, so the temperature drops, not gradually, but completely. From extreme heat to extreme cold, a swing so violent it feels almost impossible, and yet it happens every single rotation. A world that burns and freezes over and over again, without ever settling. But the strangest part is hidden in the dark. At Mercury's poles, there are craters that sunlight never reaches. Not for a moment, not ever. Their walls are angled just enough to keep the light out permanently. And inside those shadows, something unexpected exists. Ice, water ice, on a planet this close to the sun, frozen. Because without sunlight, temperature doesn't matter anymore. Cold simply stays cold, forever. It's a strange contradiction. The hottest world can also hold some of the coldest places. At the same time, now imagine standing there, not in the sunlight, but inside one of those craters. You wouldn't see the sun. You wouldn't feel its heat. just darkness, and a stillness so complete it feels unnatural. No wind, no sound, no movement at all, and above you, beyond the edge of the crater, the universe continues, unbothered. This is what Mercury really is. Not a world of fire, but a world of contrast, of extremes that never meet. Heat that never reaches the cold, light that never touches the dark, a planet divided not by geography, but by physics itself. And then there's time again. Mercury doesn't move the way you expect either. Its orbit and its rotation are locked in a strange rhythm. For every 2 times it circles the sun, it rotates 3 times on its axis, a pattern that creates days that don't behave like days. The sun rises, stops, moves backward, then rises again. A sky that hesitates, as if unsure which direction to follow. And if you were watching it, you might not trust what you see, because motion here doesn't feel natural. It feels delayed, interrupted, like time itself is slightly out of sync. And that leads to something deeper, a quieter realization. Mercury is not trying to be stable. It doesn't regulate itself. It doesn't adapt. It simply exists under whatever conditions it's given. And those conditions are unforgiving. There is no correction, no buffering, no system to smooth things out, just raw exposure to the environment of space. And maybe that's what makes it unsettling, not the heat, not the cold, but the lack of anything in between. Because on Earth, everything transitions. Day becomes night, heat fades into cool air. There are gradients, but on Mercury, there are only edges, hard transitions, one extreme directly into another with nothing to soften the change. And as you drift away from it, slowly, you begin to notice a pattern forming. Mars was a world that stopped evolving. Venus was a world that couldn't stop, and Mercury is a world that never adjusted at all. Each one missing something essential, balance. And without that balance, they become something else, not broken, just unforgiving. But we're still close to the sun, still inside the inner system. And even here, things already feel unstable. So as we begin to move outward again, past the warmth, past the familiar light, we're heading towards something different. Not hotter, not quieter, but larger, heavier, and far less forgiving in a completely different way. Because the next places won't just ignore you, they'll overwhelm you without even trying. Keep drifting. Part 5, the weight of giants. Up to this point, the worlds we've visited felt distant but understandable. Rock, heat, cold, atmosphere, or the lack of it. Things you can imagine, things you can almost stand on, but now that changes. Because as we move farther from the sun, we leave behind solid ground and enter something else entirely, something without a surface, without a boundary, a place where standing no longer means anything. Ahead of you, filling more and more of your view, is Jupiter. At first, it doesn't feel threatening. It's beautiful. Bands of color, soft gradients, swirling patterns. It almost looks calm, but that calm is an illusion. Because Jupiter is not a world in the way you understand worlds. It's a system of motion. Layers of gas stacked on top of each other with no clear separation, no surface, no solid ground. If you tried to land, you wouldn't. You would just keep falling. At the outer edge, the atmosphere feels light, almost gentle, but as you descend, something begins to change. The pressure increases, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until the gas around you doesn't feel like gas anymore. It becomes dense, heavy, almost liquid, and still, there is no surface. Now imagine continuing downward, deeper. The pressure keeps rising relentlessly until even the atoms themselves begin to behave differently. Hydrogen, the simplest element in the universe, is forced into a state it was never meant to be in. Metallic, conducting electricity, flowing like a strange, silent ocean. This is not something you would see. It's something you would become part of. Because at that depth, there is no separation between you and the environment. And above all of this, far above, there is something watching. Something that has been there for centuries. A storm. Not temporary, not seasonal, but constant. This is the Great Red Spot, a storm large enough to swallow entire planets. Been raging for over 300 years. Think about that. On Earth, storms pass hours, days, maybe weeks. But here, a storm can outlive civilizations. It doesn't weaken. It doesn't end. It simply continues. And it's not alone. Jupiter's entire atmosphere is in motion. Bands of wind moving in opposite directions, colliding, sliding past each other, creating turbulence on a scale that feels impossible. Lightning flashes far larger than anything on Earth, storms within storms, patterns that shift but never settle. And yet this isn't the most dangerous part, because surrounding Jupiter is something you can't see, but it's always there. Radiation, trapped within its immense magnetic field, forming invisible belts of high-energy particles. If you were close enough, unprotected, it wouldn't take long, minutes, maybe less, before the radiation would begin to destroy you. Not violently, but inevitably. Even the moons of Jupiter exist under this influence, constantly exposed to this invisible danger. Some of them are shaped by it, changed by it, as if the planet itself extends far beyond its visible form, reaching out into space. And that's when the scale begins to settle in. Jupiter is not just large, it dominates. It holds more mass than all the other planets combined. Its gravity controls the moquiques, asteroids, comets, dust. Even the structure of the solar system is shaped by it. It's not just a planet, it's a force. And yet, despite all of this, Jupiter is not solid. It has no true surface, no place where things end and something else begins. It is a gradient, a continuous shift from one state to another. And that makes it difficult to understand because the human mind likes boundaries, edges, clear definitions. But Jupiter doesn't give you that. It removes the idea of standing entirely. If Mercury was a world of extremes, Jupiter is a world without limits. No edge, no ground, just depth and pressure and motion that never stops. And somewhere in that endless descent, you realize something subtle. You are not meant to interact with this place, not even briefly, because there is no moment where it becomes safe. No layer where conditions stabilize. It only becomes more as you go deeper, more pressure, more heat, more unknown. And that's the shift. Up until now, the solar system has felt dangerous, but still somewhat understandable. Now, it begins to feel overwhelming. Not because it's trying to harm you, but because it doesn't need to. Its scale alone is enough. And Jupiter is only the beginning of that scale. Because farther out, there are worlds even stranger. Worlds where gravity behaves differently, where rings drift like fragile illusions, where entire systems of moons form their own quiet realities. And as we continue, you may start to notice something else. The farther we go, the less the solar system feels like a collection of places and more like a collection of conditions. Each one completely indifferent to anything that enters it. So don't resist it. Don't try to understand it all at once. Just let yourself drift a little farther. Part 6, the beauty that doesn't last. After Jupiter, you might expect something even more violent, something louder, more chaotic, but instead, what comes next feels almost peaceful at first, because drifting into view now is something that looks impossibly delicate, soft, bright, almost like it shouldn't exist at all. This is Saturn, and from a distance, it might be the most beautiful thing in the entire solar system, a giant world surrounded by rings of light, thin, precise, perfectly arranged, like something designed rather than formed. But like everything out here, that impression doesn't last. Because those rings aren't solid. They aren't structures, they're fragments. Countless pieces of ice and rock, each one moving on its own path, some no larger than dust, others as big as buildings, all orbiting together in a pattern that looks stable, but isn't. They appear smooth, continuous, but up close, they are broken, a collection of pieces that never quite come together. And what's more unsettling is how thin they are. These vast rings stretch hundreds of thousands of kilometers across, but in many places they are thinner than a city skyline, a structure so fragile that from the right angle it almost disappears, like something that only exists if you look at it correctly. Now imagine drifting closer, that is not landing, just passing through the rings themselves. You wouldn't crash into a solid surface. You would move between particles, ice drifting silently, shadows sliding across other shadows, everything moving but nothing touching for long. A system held together, only by balance, is temporary. Because Saturn's rings are are not permanent. They are falling, slowly, almost invisibly, pulled inward by gravity, drawn down by the planet's magnetic field, a process so gradual you whooping, and yet it never stops. Particle by particle, the rings are disappearing, fading into the planet below. And that changes the way you see them, because what looks timeless is actually fleeting. A moment in a much longer story. Saturn hasn't always had these rings, and one day it won't have them again. You are looking at something in the middle of its existence, not the beginning, not the end, just a brief, beautiful phase. And beneath those rings, the planet itself turns, fast, so fast that it bulges at the center, flattens slightly at the poles, not because it's soft, but because it's spinning too quickly to remain perfectly round, a giant shaped by motion. And like Jupiter, Saturn is not solid. There is no surface waiting below, only layers, gas becoming liquid, liquid becoming something stranger as pressure increases, and deeper still, conditions you cannot survive or even fully imagine. But Saturn has something else, something quieter, something almost mathematical. At its north pole, there is a storm, but not like the one on Jupiter. This one has a shape, a perfect hexagon, 6 sides, sharp edges, a geometry tens of thousands of kilometers, naturally formed, persisting for decades, possibly longer. A shape that shouldn't exist in chaos, but does. And that's when the feeling shifts again, because Saturn doesn't feel violent, it doesn't feel hostile in the same way as Jupiter. It feels precise, balanced, almost controlled, and yet it isn't. Because everything here is still temporary. The rings are fading, the storms are shifting, the structure is constantly adjusting, even if it looks perfect. And maybe that's what makes Saturn unsettling. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's deceptive. It looks stable, it looks eternal, but it isn't. It's a reminder that beauty doesn't mean permanence, that symmetry doesn't mean control, and that something can feel complete even while it's slowly disappearing. As you drift away, the rings begin to thin out again, fading into lines, then into light, then into nothing. And behind you, Saturn continues unchanged for now. But ahead, things are beginning to tilt. Literally, because the next world doesn't behave the way planets are supposed to. It doesn't spin upright, it doesn't follow the pattern, it rolls sideways. And by the time you reach it, you may start to feel something new. Not fear, not awe, but disorientation. Because the farther you go, the less the solar system feels like a system at all, and more like a collection of exceptions. Part 7, the planet that forgot how to stand. By now, you've started to notice something. Each world we pass breaks a different rule. Mars stopped changing. Venus couldn't stop. Mercury never adjusted. Jupiter never had a surface. Saturn looks stable, but isn't. And now we arrive somewhere that doesn't even follow the most basic expectation. Because planets are supposed to stand upright. Not perfectly, but close. A slight tilt. A gentle angle, something that still feels balanced. But this one doesn't. Drifting into view now is Uranus, and at first you might not notice anything wrong. It's calm, pale blue, almost featureless, no dramatic storms, no obvious chaos, just a smooth, quiet sphere. But then your perspective shifts, and you realize something isn't aligned. Not the clouds, not the light, the entire planet. Uranus is tilted so far that it doesn't spin like the others. It rolls with an axial tilt of about 98 degrees, lying on its side, the poles pointing almost directly at the sun. That's Uranus, a planet that forgot how to stand. And that changes everything. Seasons don't behave the way you expect. They don't shift gradually, they don't alternate smoothly. Instead, one pole faces the sun for decades. 42 years of continuous daylight, followed by 42 years of complete darkness, not a day, an era, a lifetime spent in light, then another spent in night. Imagine standing there, not watching a sunrise, but waiting for one that won't happen for decades, or living in daylight that never fades, not bright, not warm, just constant, unchanging. And yet, Uranus doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't show its extremes the way other planets do. There are no giant storms visible from afar, no massive bands of color, just stillness, a quiet surface hiding a very unusual reality. But that stillness is deceptive because beneath those soft clouds there is movement. Subtle, slow, almost hidden, winds that move quietly through layers of gas and ice, a structure that feels less like a storm and more like a deep current, something flowing without urgency. And then there's the cold. Uranus is one of the coldest places in the entire solar system. Colder than you might expect, even at this distance, because unlike other giant planets, it doesn't seem to radiate much internal heat. It just stays cold, as if something inside it has gone quiet. And that adds another layer to the feeling, because Jupiter and Saturn feel alive, active, full of motion and energy. Uranus feels distant, detached, not just from us, but from itself. Its rings are there too, corradial, but they're faint, dark, hard to see. Not like Saturn's bright glowing bands. These are subtle, almost hidden, like traces of something that was never meant to be noticed. And its moons orbit in a lime T. Everything around Uranus follows its strange orientation, as if the entire system accepted the shift and adapted to it. But the question remains, why? Why would a planet end up like this? The leading idea is simple. A collision, long ago. Something massive struck Uranus and knocked it sideways. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to change it forever. And since then, it has never returned to anything resembling normal. And that's where the discomfort settles in, because Uranus isn't chaotic, it's not unstable, it's consistent, perfectly consistent in a state that feels wrong. A world that adapted to being broken. And maybe that's the most unsettling idea so far. Not destruction, not extremes, but adaptation to something that shouldn't have happened, a new normal that formed out of an accident. Because if something like that can happen, if a planet can be permanently altered and continue as if nothing is wrong, then stability becomes a much more fragile idea. As you drift past Uranus, its pale blue color fades slowly into the dark. The tilt becomes less obvious until it just looks like another sphere in the distance. But you know now that appearances don't mean much out here, that even the calmest worlds can hold the strangest truths. And ahead, the darkness deepens. The light from the sun grows weaker, colder, more distant. And waiting out there is a planet where the winds move faster than sound itself, where storms don't just last, they dominate. And by the time you reach it, you may start to feel something else entirely, not just disorientation, but isolation. Because the farther you go, the less the sun feels like a presence, and the more space begins to feel like it's taking over. Keep drifting. Part 8, the wind that never stops. By now, the sun is no longer dominant. It's still there, but it feels distant, dimmer, colder, less like a source of life and more like a memory. And in that fading light, another world begins to form. Not bright, not inviting, but active, restless. This is Neptune, the farthest major planet from the sun, a place where energy should be scarce, where motion should slow, where everything should feel quiet, but it doesn't. Because Neptune is one of the most dynamic worlds in the entire solar system, and no one expected that. At this distance, sunlight is weak, barely enough to illuminate the clouds, barely enough to warm anything at all. So, by all logic, this planet should be calm, frozen, still. But instead, it moves. Winds sweep across Neptune's atmosphere at speeds that shouldn't be possible, over 2,000 kilometers per hour. The speed of sound on Earth, faster than any storm we've ever experienced. And yet there is no sound, no thunder, no roar, just silent motion, a planet wrapped in supersonic wind that you would never hear coming. Imagine drifting there, suspended in that atmosphere. You wouldn't feel a gentle breeze, you wouldn't feel gradual movement, you would be carried instantly, pulled into a current that doesn't slow down, that doesn't stop. And unlike Jupiter, where the violence is visible, Neptune hides it. Its deep blue color feels calm, smooth, almost peaceful. But beneath that color, storms are forming. There was once a dark spot, a storm, large enough to rival Jupiter's great red spot, and then it disappeared. Not gradually, not predictably, just gone, replaced by something else. Because on Neptune, storms don't last forever. And they appear, they move, they vanish. A system that feels unstable, unfixed, always changing, but never settling. And that raises a question: where does the energy come from? So far from the sun, there shouldn't be enough heat to drive this kind of motion. And yet, Neptune radiates more energy than it receives from some way hidden source, a quiet heat rising upward, powering everything. So even here, in the coldest regions, the solar system is not at rest. It never truly is. And then there's something else, something even stranger. Deep inside the atmosphere, far below the clouds, pressure increases, temperature rises, and under those conditions, matter begins to change. Methane breaks apart, carbon atoms are forced together, compressed till they become something solid, something crystalline, diamonds. And those diamonds may fall through layers of darkness no light has ever reached, no observer has ever seen. Think about that. An entire world where storms rage at supersonic speeds while deep below it rains diamonds in complete silence. And no one is there to witness it. No one hears it. No one confirms it directly. And yet, everything we understand about physics suggests it could be real. That's when the feeling shifts again, because Neptune doesn't feel hostile in the way Jupiter does. It doesn't feel overwhelming. It feels alien, not just different, but disconnected. The farther you go, the less familiar the rules become, the less intuitive things feel, until eventually you stop expecting things to make sense. And Neptune is that point, the place where intuition starts to fail. Because here, distance doesn't mean stillness, cold doesn't mean inactivity, and darkness doesn't mean emptiness. It means something else entirely, something deeper, something harder to predict. As you drift past Neptune, the sun behind you is now just a bright star, one among many. And ahead there are no more major planets, no more familiar structures, just fragments, ice, rock, remnants of formation that never became anything complete. And beyond that, something even more distant, a region where objects drift for billions of years, barely touched by anything at all. And as you move toward that darkness, you may start to feel something new, not just isolation, but distance from everything you understand. Because out here, the solar system begins to fade. Keep drifting. Part 9, the things that never became worlds. By the time you pass Neptune, something changes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but noticeably. There are no more giants ahead, no more dominant shapes, no more clear destinations, just fragments. The solar system begins to feel unfinished, like something that almost formed and then stopped. You're entering a region not of planets, but of leftovers. This is the outer debris field, the distant extensions of structure, the quiet remains of formation itself. Somewhere out here, drifting slowly through darkness, is Pluto, once considered the 9th planet, now something else, reclassified, redefined, not because it changed, but because our understanding did. And that's the first feeling this region gives you: uncertainty. Pluto is small, cold, distant, and yet it holds something unexpected. A heart-shaped region, bright against the darkness, almost comforting. But beneath that surface, something may be hidden. A subsurface ocean are in a place where temperatures should make that impossible, protected, insulated, trapped beneath layers of ice. And that changes the way you see it, because even here, at the edge of sunlight, there might still be motion, still be change, still be something quietly active. But Pluto isn't alone, not even close. Surrounding it, stretching far beyond what you can easily imagine, is a region filled with objects. Thousands, maybe millions, of icy bodies drifting in slow, distant orbits. This is the entity place Kuiper Belt-ing of remnants left over from the formation of the solar system. Some of these objects are small, irregular, barely held together. Others are large enough to become round, dwarf planets, worlds that almost formed fully but didn't quite make it. And that's the pattern here. Almost. Not quite. Close, but incomplete. There are more dwarf planets out here than there are true planets in the inner system. And that aeons of order, because what you thought was rare is actually common, and what you thought was complete is just one version of many possibilities. Some of these distant worlds are incredibly bright, reflective, covered in ice so fresh it shines like snow in sunlight. Others are dark, ancient, barely visible at all. Some spin quickly, so quickly they stretch into unusual shapes, not quite spherical, not quite stable, just rotating, as if trying to hold themselves together. And the space between them is vast, much more empty than you might expect. If you were drifting through this region, you could travel for years and never come close to anything. Not because there's nothing here, but because everything is so far apart, and that creates a strange feeling, not of danger, but of absence. Because here, the solar system doesn't feel crowded. It feels stretched, thin, as if its structure is fading. And somewhere in that vastness, there are objects that don't follow simple paths, elongated orbits, strange trajectories, movements that suggest something unseen. A possibility that there is still something out here we haven't found yet. A larger body, a distant planet pulling gently on everything around it. Not confirmed, not proven, but hinted at. And that idea lingers, because even at the edge of what we know, there may still be structure, still be influence, still be something shaping everything quietly. And beyond the Kuiper Belt, far beyond, there is something even more distant. A region we've never directly seen, only inferred, only imagined through the motion of objects that pass through it. This is the entity place, Oort cloud, Hypothetica Oort cloud, the entire solar system, extending possibly nearly a light year away. Not a disk, not a ring, a distant shell of icy bodies. And these objects are barely bound to the sun at all. A passing star, a subtle gravitational shift, could send one of them falling inward, becoming a comet, crossing the entire solar system, appearing suddenly from the dark. Which means, even here, nothing is completely still. Nothing is completely isolated. Everything is connected, even at the greatest distances. And as you drift outward, past Pluto, past the scattered ice, past the faint structure of the Kuiper Belt, the sun becomes smaller, dimmer, just another star. And that's when the realization settles in. You are no longer in a place that feels like a system. You are in a boundary, a transition between what belongs to the sun and what belongs to everything else. And ahead, there is nothing familiar left. No planets, no clear paths, just distance and time. And somewhere in that darkness, there are objects that have been drifting unchanged for billions of years, not evolving, not interacting, just existing. And maybe that's the quietest realization so far, that not everything is moving towards something, not everything is becoming. Some things simply remain. Keep drifting. Part 10, the edge that isn't an edge. At some point, you expect there to be a boundary, a line, a border, something that clearly separates inside from outside. But as you drift farther, that expectation begins to fall apart. Because the solar system doesn't really end, not in the way you imagine. There is no wall, no final planet, no sudden drop into nothing. Instead, there is a transition, a gradual fading. Behind you, the sun is now just another star, brighter than most, but no longer dominant, no longer central. And around you, space feels different, not empty, but thinner, less influenced. You are approaching something that isn't a place, but a condition. This is where the sun's influence begins to weaken, not its gravity that extends much farther, but something else, its presence. The solar wind, a constant stream of particles flowing outward from the sun, has been surrounding you this entire time, invisible, expanding, creating a kind of bubble around everything you've passed. This bubble is called the heliosphere, and for a long time, you've been inside it without noticing, or reaching its edge. This boundary is known as the entity place Hell Heliopause Arface, not a wall, but a shift. Here, the pressure from the sun's particles meets the pressure of interstellar space, and for the first time, they are equal. Beyond this point, the sun is no longer in control. Imagine that for a moment. Everything you've seen so far, every planet, every moon, every fragment of ice and rock, all of it exists inside a kind of protective bubble. And now, you are leaving it. There have only been a few objects that have ever crossed this boundary. Not people, not ships, just machines. One of them is end spacecraft Voyager 1 decades ago, still moving, still sending signals. It took more than 40 years just to reach this point, traveling wilt before it, and even now, it hasn't truly left the solar system. It has only left the sun's breath. And that's the unsettling part, because if it takes decades just to reach the edge of influence, then the true size of what you've been drifting through is far larger than it felt. Now imagine crossing it. There is no moment of impact, no visible change, just a shift in what surrounds you. The solar wind fades, the particles change direction, the background of space becomes something else. You are now in interstellar space. And yet, the sun is still there, still pulling, still present. Which means this wasn't really the end, just another layer. And that realization begins to settle in. There is no clean boundary, no final step, just transitions one after another. And beyond this point, things become even less familiar. The structure of the solar system no longer defines your surroundings. Instead, you are part of something larger. The interstellar medium, a thin mixture of gas and dust spread across the galaxy. So sparse, it feels like nothing, but still present, and moving through it is the entire solar system itself. Not stationary, not fixed, but traveling slowly through a region known as the local interstellar cloud, which means everything is also moving. The sun, the planets, the distant ice, all of it drifting together through a larger environment. And that changes the perspective completely, because now the solar system doesn't feel like a center. It feels like a traveler, just one system among countless others, moving through the galaxy without a fixed position, without a permanent place. And somewhere in that realization, something becomes clear. There is no true edge, only the point where one influence gives way to another. And that means no matter how far you go, there will always be something beyond. And as you drift here between systems, between influences, between definitions, you may begin to feel something unfamiliar, not fear, not awe, but scale. A quiet awareness that what you thought was vast is only a small part of something much larger. And that this journey hasn't really been about distance. It's been about perspective. Because now if you look back, everything you passed, everything that once felt enormous, fits inside a single idea, a bubble. And ahead, there is no map, no structure, no clear path, just space. And the quiet realization that you are no longer drifting through a system. You are drifting through the universe itself. Keep drifting. Part 11, the place between stars and... At some point, you stop thinking of distance in kilometers or miles or even orbits, because those units don't really apply anymore. Out here, distance becomes something else, time. Not the kind you measure on a clock, but the kind you feel in how long something takes to happen, or how long it doesn't. You've crossed beyond the familiar, beyond the planets, beyond the heliopause, and now you are between stars. At first, it doesn't feel like anything has changed. The darkness is still there, the silence is still complete, the stars still surround you. But something is different, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The space here is not empty, it just feels that way. This region is filled with something called the interstellar medium, a thin mixture of gas, mostly hydrogen, and tiny particles of dust. So sparse that even the best vacuum on Earth would feel dense by comparison. If you could gather it, you would need a space the size of a city to collect just a handful of atoms. And yet it matters, because this is what fills the space between stars. This is what everything moves through. At this scale, motion becomes strange. You are still moving, still drifting forward, but there is no reference point. No nearby object to measure your progress against. No horizon, no sense of approach. Just stars. Distant, fixed, unchanging. Or at least they seem that way, because if you wait long enough, if you could remain here for thousands of years, you would begin to see them shift, slowly, almost reluctantly. The constellations would break apart, the patterns would dissolve, and new shapes would take their place. Nothing out here is truly still, it just moves, on timescales you're not used to. And that's when another realization forms. The solar system was never stationary. It was traveling this entire time, moving through this medium at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour, carrying everything with it, planets, moons, fragments, all of it drifting together. And now that you're outside of it, you can feel that motion differently. Not as speed, but as direction. You are no longer orbiting something, you are passing through something. And that changes the feeling completely, because orbits feel contained, predictable, bound, but this feels open, endless in a way that doesn't offer structure. And then there's something else, something quieter, something that doesn't come from outside, but from the absence of outside. There is no up here, no down, no center. Even the sun, which once felt like an anchor, is now just another point behind you. And ahead, there is no clear destination, just other stars, too far to reach, too distant to matter in any immediate sense. The nearest one is more than 4 light years away, which means even traveling at the speed of light, it would take over 4 years to get there. And nothing you've built comes close to that speed. So in practical terms, you are alone. Not because there is nothing else, but because everything else is too far away to interact with. And that's a different kind of isolation. Not emptiness, but separation. Because out here, you begin to understand something subtle. Connection requires proximity. And without it, even a universe full of objects can feel empty. And yet, there are still events happening. Particles collide, magnetic fields shift, radiation passes through, carrying information from distant stars, signals from places you will never reach. And sometimes, a disturbance moves through this medium. A shockwave from a distant supernova, traveling for millions of years, spreading outward, fading slowly but never completely disappearing. Which means, even here, you're not untouched. You are part of something larger, even if you can't see it. And that might be the most unsettling idea so far, because distance doesn't mean isolation from influence. It just means you don't know what's affecting you. As you continue drifting, the solar system behind you becomes indistinguishable, just another star among many, no longer special, no longer central, and that realization settles in quietly. Everything you've known, everything that once felt enormous, is now just a small region in a much larger structure. And ahead, there is no clear next step. No next planet, no next boundary. Just more of this, more distance, more time, more quiet, and somewhere in that quiet, a question begins to form. Not about where you are, but about what it means to be anywhere at all. Keep drifting. Part 12, the quiet that remembers everything. Out here, nothing feels urgent anymore. Nothing rushes, nothing reacts quickly. And that creates a different kind of silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of time, stretching too far to notice movement. Because in interstellar space, change still happens. It just happens so slowly that it almost feels like it doesn't. And that's where your sense of scale begins to shift again. Back in the solar system, you could measure things in years, in orbits, in cycles. But here, those units stop working, because what matters now is not years. It's thousands, millions, even billions. Time becomes something geological, something cosmic. And in that scale, you begin to notice something unsettling. Nothing out here is in a hurry. Stars are forming, but over millions of years. Clouds of gas collapse slowly, barely changing from one human lifetime to the next. And other stars are dying, exploding, collapsing. But even those events, rare, distant, feel almost silent from here. Because distance softens everything, even violence. Somewhere far away, a massive star might collapse, triggering a supernova, releasing more energy in a moment than the sun will in its entire lifetime. But here, you wouldn't hear it, you wouldn't feel it. You would only see a new point of light slowly appearing in the sky, and then, over time, fading. And that's when something becomes clear. Events don't feel intense when you're far enough away. They feel distant. And that distance changes how reality feels. Because if something enormous can happen and still feel quiet, then scale is doing more than just measuring size. It's shaping perception. Now drift a little farther, not physically, just mentally. Imagine staying here, not for a moment, not for a year, but for millions of years. Watching, waiting. At first, nothing changes. The stars remain fixed. The darkness remains constant. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, patterns begin to shift. Stars move relative to each other, new ones appear, old ones fade, and the space around you begins to evolve. Not because anything is rushing, but because everything is always moving. And that leads to a strange realization. Stillness is an illusion of timescale. Things only appear still because you are not watching long enough. And that idea starts to reach back to everything you've seen, the planets, the storms, the rings. They all felt dynamic, active, alive in their own way. But from this perspective, even they are slow. Even Jupiter's storms, even Saturn's rings, even Neptune's winds are temporary, transient. Given enough time, they will all change or disappear entirely. And that's when the final shift begins. Because now you are no longer thinking about places. You are thinking about processes, formation, evolution, decay. Everything you passed was part of a timeline, not a fixed state. And that includes the solar system itself, because it hasn't always looked the way it does now, and it won't stay this way forever. The sun will change, expand, transform. The planets will shift, orbits will drift, structures will collapse. And eventually, what feels stable now will no longer exist, not because something went wrong, but because change is the only constant at this scale. And here, in the space between stars, you can feel that truth more clearly, because nothing here pretends to be permanent. Everything is either forming or fading, and you are drifting through the middle of that process, not at the beginning, not at the end, just in between. And maybe that's the quietest realization of all, that existence is not a place you arrive at, it's something you pass through, slowly, unavoidably, like everything else. And as you continue drifting, there is one final shift waiting, not in space, but in perspective. Because after everything you've seen, after every extreme, every distance, every scale, there is still one place that feels different from all the others. Not because it's larger, not because it's more powerful, but because it's the only place where you ever truly belonged. And soon, you'll begin to see it again. From very far away, keep drifting. Part 13, the only place that noticed you. After all that distance, after everything you've passed, something unexpected begins to happen. You start to look back, not because there's something pulling you, not because there's a signal, but because there is finally something you recognize. Far behind you, almost lost among countless stars, there is a faint point of light. Not brighter than the others, not larger, not special in any obvious way. And yet you know what it is. That is Earth. But from here, it doesn't look like a world. It doesn't look like oceans or continents or clouds moving across the sky. It looks like nothing, just a dot. And that realization lands quietly, almost too quietly. Everything you've ever known, every sound, every voice, every moment of your life exists inside something that now looks indistinguishable from the background. Not because it's unimportant, but because scale doesn't preserve meaning. And that's the shift. Out here, importance doesn't change size, significance doesn't change visibility. Things don't appear larger because they matter more. They appear larger because they are closer. And Earth is no longer close, so it disappears. But something else begins to form in its place, not visually, not physically, but conceptually, because Earth is different in a way that none of the other places were. Not because it's safer, not because it's stable, but because it's the only place you've encountered that responded to you. Every other world was indifferent. Mars didn't notice you, Venus didn't resist you, Jupiter didn't react to your presence. They existed exactly the same, whether you were there or not. But Earth is different. It changes because of you. The air responds, the environment shifts, the surface adapts. Not always gently, not always predictably, but there is interaction. feedback, a system that includes you. And from this distance, that becomes its defining feature. Not life, not water, not atmosphere, but connection. Because out here, nothing else connects. Everything else exists in isolation, in balance with physics, but not with awareness. And that creates a strange contrast. The farther you go, the more the universe feels indifferent. And the smaller Earth becomes, the more it feels unique. Not in size, not in position, but in function. It is not just a place that exists, it is a place where existence is experienced. And that's different, because everything else you've seen is part of a system, but Earth is part of a story. And from here, that story is invisible. No signals of meaning, no indication of thought, no trace of memory, just light. And that's all the universe sees, a small reflection of a distant star. And yet, inside that reflection, there are questions, there are thoughts. There is awareness looking back out into the same darkness, trying to understand it, trying to map it, trying to find meaning in something that doesn't provide it directly. And that's where the discomfort settles in. Because the universe doesn't seem to notice that effort. It doesn't respond, it doesn't acknowledge, it simply continues. And yet, the effort still happens, which means meaning might not come from the universe itself. It might come from the act of trying to understand it. And Earth is where that act occurs, a small place in a vast structure where the universe becomes aware of itself, even if only briefly. And from this distance, that might be the most significant thing you've encountered so far. Not the storms, not the extremes, not the scale, but the existence of something that notices them. And as you continue drifting, Earth becomes harder to distinguish, fading into the background of stars, until eventually you can't pick it out anymore. And that's when the final realization begins to form. Not about where you are, not about what you've seen, but about perspective itself. Because everything you experienced, everything that felt large, everything that felt overwhelming, only felt that way because of where you were when you saw it. And now you are somewhere else, and everything has changed. Keep drifting. Part 14, the realization that doesn't leave. At some point, you stop moving forward, not physically. You are still drifting, still carried through ace that doesn't resist you. But mentally, something pauses because there is nowhere else to go in the way you expected. No final destination, no ultimate place waiting to be reached. Just more of the same, more distance, more silence, more time. And that's when the realization begins. Not suddenly, not clearly, but quietly. Everything you've experienced, every world, every extreme, every boundary, was never leading somewhere. It was showing you something. Because at the beginning, the solar system felt structured, ordered, understandable, a sequence of places, each one following rules. But as you moved outward, that structure dissolved. Planets became conditions, distances became time, and boundaries became transitions. And now, there is no structure left at all, just existence. And that's the part that stays with you, because once you see it, it doesn't go away. The idea that everything is part of a process with no fixed center. Not the sun, not the solar system, not even the galaxy. Everything is moving, everything is changing, everything is temporary. Even the things that felt permanent. The planets you passed are evolving. The sun is aging. The stars around you are forming and fading. And even the space between them is not truly empty. It carries history, radiation, fragments of past events that are still traveling, which means nothing is ever truly gone. It just becomes something else. And that leads to a deeper discomfort. Because if everything changes, then stability is only temporary, not just out here, everywhere, even on Earth. The ground feels solid, the sky feels constant, time feels predictable. But those are local conditions, not universal truths. From a different perspective, Earth is just another moment in a long sequence of moments. And that doesn't make it meaningless, but it does change how it fits into everything else. Because meaning is not built into the universe. It is created by the way you experience it. And that realization doesn't resolve itself. It doesn't become comfortable. It just stays, like a quiet thought that you can't fully ignore. And maybe that's why this journey feels different from anything else, because it doesn't give you answers. It removes assumptions. It takes the familiar and slowly stretches it until it no longer feels stable. Until you're left with something simpler, not comforting, not alarming, just true. That everything exists without needing to justify itself. That scale doesn't care about importance, that distance doesn't remove connection, and that time moves everything forward, whether you notice it or not. And now, as you drift here between everything and nothing, there is one final shift left. Not in space, not in distance, but in how you see it all. Because the question is no longer, where are you? It becomes, what does it mean to be anywhere at all? And that question doesn't have a clear answer. It doesn't resolve. It lingers, just like the silence around you. And as everything continues unchanged, unbothered, you begin to understand something subtle. The universe doesn't need to be understood to exist, but you need to try to feel like you exist within it. And that effort, that quiet attempt to make sense of it all, might be the only thing that truly belongs to you. Not the planets, not the stars, not the space between them, just the awareness you are here thinking about it. And that is where this journey finally turns. Not outward anymore, but inward. Keep drifting. Part 15. The thought you can't escape. At some point, you stop asking where you are because that question no longer works. There is no clear here anymore. No boundary, no reference point, just awareness floating inside something too large to fully define. And that's when the final realization begins. Not about space, not about distance, but about you. Because everything you've experienced, every planet, every storm, every silent region of darkness has been filtered through one thing, your perspective. And now that perspective has changed completely. You've seen worlds that burn, worlds that freeze, worlds that never settled, and worlds that never even formed. You've seen storms that last centuries, winds that move faster than sound, rings that are already disappearing. You've passed the edge of influence, left behind the breath of a star, and drifted into the space between everything. And through all of it, one thing remained constant. You were there to notice it, and that changes everything. Because without that awareness, none of it would feel large, none of it would feel quiet, none of it would feel unsettling. It would simply exist. And maybe that's still what it's doing. The universe isn't trying to overwhelm you with it isn't trying to impress you. It isn't even trying to be understood. It's just there. And yet, you experience it. You interpret it, you try to make sense of it, and in doing so, you create something the universe doesn't provide on its own. Meaning, not built into space, not written into physics, but constructed by the act of observing. And that leads to a quiet, almost uncomfortable thought. What if the most significant thing in the entire journey was never the places you visited, but the fact that you were able to experience them at all? Because think about it. The storms on Jupiter will continue, whether anyone sees them or not. The winds on Neptune will keep moving in complete silence. The rings of Saturn will keep fading, slowly disappearing without announcement. And the distant ice, wet beyond Pluto, will continue drifting unchanged for billions of years. None of it needs to be witnessed. None of it needs to be understood. And yet, you tried. You imagined standing there, feeling it, experiencing it. And that act, however small, is something the rest of the universe doesn't seem to do. Because as far as we can tell, most of it is silent, not just physically, but conceptually. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't reflect. It doesn't wonder what it is, but you do. And that might be the strangest part of all. In a system filled with extremes, violence, and indifference, the most unusual thing might not be a planet or a storm or a distant boundary. It might be awareness itself. A brief moment where the universe, through you, becomes something more than just existence, something that notices. And that idea doesn't resolve. It doesn't become comforting. It doesn't become frightening. It just stays with you. Because if awareness is rare, if meaning is something created rather than given, then your experience, your thoughts, your quiet attempt to understand all of this might be more significant than any individual place you've seen. Not larger, not more powerful, but different. And difference is what stood out across this entire journey. Every world that felt strange felt that way because it broke expectations, because it didn't behave the way you thought it would. And now you are the thing that doesn't quite fit. An observer in a system that doesn't require observation, a source of meaning in a structure that doesn't provide it. And that realization doesn't push you outward anymore. It pulls you inward. Back to that small, distant point you can no longer see. Back to Earth, not because it is central, not because it is large, but because it is where this awareness exists. A thin layer on the surface of a small planet where conditions happen to align just enough for something to notice, and that alignment is fragile, not guaranteed, not permanent, just one moment in a much larger timeline, and yet it's the only moment you have. So as everything continues, as stars move, as planets evolve, as the universe expands quietly in every direction, there is one thing that doesn't need to be resolved. You are here, not at the center, not at the edge, just somewhere in between, aware. And maybe that's enough. No final answer, no clear conclusion. Just a quiet understanding that the universe doesn't explain itself. And it doesn't have to, because the moment you noticed it, you created something it never required. A question, and that question is where everything begins. So there is no ending here, no final point. Just this, the silence, the scale, and the awareness that you're still drifting, and somehow still thinking about it. Keep drifting. Part 16, the drift that never ends. There is a moment so quiet you almost miss it. Nothing changes, no new world appears, no boundary is crossed, and yet something is different, because for the first time you're no longer searching. You're not looking for the next place, not expecting another discovery, not waiting for something to reveal itself. You're simply here. And that changes the feeling completely, because every step before this was part of a direction, inward, then outward, through planets, through storms, through distance, through silence. But now there is no direction left, only continuation. And that's when you begin to notice something subtle. The drifting never actually stopped. Even when you were near Earth, you were drifting, orbiting, moving through space, carried by something larger. Even when you were on solid ground, you were never still. And that realization lingers, because stillness was never real. It was just too slow to notice. Everything moves. The Earth spins, circling the sun moves through the galaxy drifts among others, and all of it is happening right now, without pause, without asking. And for a long time, you experience that motion without thinking about it, because your frame of reference was local, ground beneath your feet, sky above your head. But now, that frame is gone. There is no ground here, no horizon, only motion and awareness of it, and that awareness changes something deeper. Because once you see motion at this scale, you can't go back to thinking of things as fixed, not completely. Even if you return, even if you lie down again, even if the world feels still, some part of you will remember that everything is already moving. And that includes you, not just physically, but in time, because time itself is another kind of drift. You don't stand still in it, you move through it constantly. One moment becomes the next, without effort, without control. And just like space, there is no boundary you can see, no edge, just continuation. And that's where the final layer reveals itself. Because this journey was never only about space, it was about perspective, about stretching your sense of scale until it no longer fits comfortably, until the familiar feels temporary, until the distant feels connected. And now you're left with something simple. There is no final answer, no complete understanding, no point where everything suddenly makes sense. Only awareness. And that awareness doesn't resolve the universe. It just changes how you exist within it, because you can't stop the motion. You can't slow the drift. You can't step outside of it. All you can do is notice it. And maybe that's enough. Because in a universe that doesn't explain itself, awareness becomes its own kind of anchor. Not something that stops movement, but something that gives it meaning. Even if that meaning is temporary, even if it only exists for as long as you're thinking about it. And that's where the journey settles. Not in a place, not in a conclusion, but in a state. A quiet understanding that you are part of something that doesn't need to acknowledge you in order for you to experience it. And that experience is happening right now. Not in the past, not in some distant future, but here, in this moment. As you listen, as you drift, as you let your thoughts slow down just to notice the space between them. Because even your thoughts follow the same pattern. They appear, they move, they fade, just like everything else. And in between them, there is silence. Not empty, just unfilled. The same kind of silence that exists between stars. And maybe that's the closest connection of all. That the structure of your awareness and the structure of the universe aren't completely separate. They both contain space. They both contain motion. They both contain moments that appear and disappear. And neither one needs to explain why. So there is no ending here. No final statement. No conclusion waiting at the edge. Just the continuation of everything. The planets still turning, the stars still forming, the space between them still stretching, and you still here, aware of it. For a moment, a very small moment in something that doesn't measure time the way you do. And yet, it's enough to notice, enough to feel, enough to drift just a little more gently into the quiet. So don't look for the end. There isn't one. Just let the motion continue. Let the thoughts fade. Let the silence expand. And somewhere in that silence, without needing to hold on to anything, you might realize you were never separate from it. You were always part of the drift, and you still are. Keep drifting. What if the most unsettling thing about the solar system is not how violent it is, but how indifferent it remains, even when you finally understand it? Not completely, but enough. Because by now, you've seen it differently. Not as a diagram, not as a collection of labeled objects, but as a system of processes, gravity pulling everything into motion, energy flowing outward from the sun, entropy quietly increasing everywhere. Nothing static, nothing permanent, just equations playing out in real space. And yet, that's not how it feels. Because when you look at Saturn, you don't think of angular momentum, you think of beauty. When you imagine the storms of Jupiter, you don't think of fluid dynamics, you feel scale. And when you remember that small, distant point, Earth, you don't think of chemistry, you think of home. And that's the tension. Physics describes what is happening, but it doesn't describe what it feels like to notice it. Because the solar system is not aware of itself. It doesn't pause, it doesn't reflect, it doesn't wonder why it exists. It simply follows laws. Gravity curves motion, energy dissipates, systems evolve toward equilibrium, and eventually everything moves toward stillness. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. And yet, in the middle of that inevitability, something unusual happens. You, a system built from the same particles following the same laws, somehow develop the ability to step back and observe the whole thing. To ask questions that physics itself never asks. Why does it feel like something? Why does scale create awe? Why does silence feel heavy? Physics doesn't answer that. It explains the motion of planets, the fusion inside stars, the structure of space itself. But it does not explain why a quiet night sky can make you feel small, or why that feeling matters. And maybe that's where the philosophical part begins. Because if everything in the solar system can be described by equations, but your experience of it cannot, then something interesting is happening. Not outside the system, but inside your perception of it. Because from a purely physical perspective, there is no importance. The sun is not more meaningful than a grain of dust. It is simply more massive, more energetic, more influential. But meaning is not a physical property. It doesn't exist in mass or temperature or velocity. It exists in awareness. And that changes how the solar system feels, because now it's not just a place, it's a relationship between what exists and something that can notice it. Without that awareness, Jupiter's storms are just motion. Saturn's rings are just particles. Earth is just chemistry. But with awareness, they become something else, something experienced, something interpreted, something that feels real in a different way. And that leads to one final question. If the universe does not create meaning, but awareness does, then where does meaning actually come from? Is it something discovered or something created? And if it's created, does that make it less real or more? Because everything you've felt in this journey, the quiet unease, the sense of scale, the strange calm, none of it exists in the solar system itself. It exists in you. And yet, it was triggered by something real, something physical, something measurable. So the experience is a bridge between physics and perception, between what is and what it feels like to notice it. And maybe that bridge is the most interesting place of all, because it's the only place where the universe becomes more than just motion. It becomes something you can reflect on. And now, after everything, after all the distance, all the silence, you're back where you started. Not physically, but mentally, looking at the solar system again. But this time, it doesn't feel the same. It's not just planets orbiting a star. It's a dynamic system moving through space, changing over time, following rules that don't care if you understand them. And yet, you tried anyway. You followed it outward, you stretched your perspective, you sat with the silence, and you stayed long enough to feel something shift. And maybe that's enough. Not complete understanding, not final answers. Just a different way of seeing. A quieter awareness that you're part of this system, not separate from it. Made of the same atoms, following the same laws, and yet able to notice it, and rarest that might be the rarest thing of all. So before you drift too far back into your own world, before the thoughts return, before the noise comes back, if this journey gave you even a moment of quiet, a different perspective, or just a place to rest your mind, you can gently like the video and subscribe, not as an interruption, just as a small signal that this kind of quiet is worth continuing. Because there are still more questions, not louder ones, just deeper ones, the kind that don't demand answers but stay with you long after the video ends. And maybe tonight, as you close your eyes, you'll still feel it, that slow, quiet drift, the awareness that everything is moving, and that somehow you're here to notice it. Keep drifting.